When U.S. Army General Robert Brown spoke of the 2018 recipient of the Manaoke Koa Spirit of the Warrior Award, he said, "Awardees demonstrate unparalleled patronage for and civilian leadership toward our Army." Allen Hoe embodies those qualities. While each nominee for the award is deserving, we feel Allen's dedication to the Army is truly outstanding. 50 years prior to General Brown's statement, the Army sent a special invitation, a draft notice, to the same Allen Hoe, who admits he was a typical local boy of the late 60s, focused only on surfing, hot rods, and girls. But a 10-month combat tour in a small country in Southeast Asia turned this local boy into a soldier's soldier. Vietnam veteran Allen Hoe, next on Long Story Short.
One-on-one, engaging conversations with some of Hawaii's most intriguing people. Long Story Short with Leslie Wilcox.
Aloha mai kako, I'm Leslie Wilcox. Allen Hoe's father was from Kalihi on Oahu, and his mother was raised in Moloa'a on Kauai. He points out his ancestors were all subjects of monarchies. On his father's side, Chinese and Japanese. His mother, Hawaiian, English, Scottish, German, and Spanish. His father was a World War II veteran, and there's evidence of warriors serving their country throughout Hoe's family tree, from the Queen's Royal Guard in India to a war lieutenant for King Kamehameha.
Interesting background.
Yeah.
Now, you were raised a regular local
Typical
kid?
local boy, right. You know, in the 60s, focus on surfing, rock and roll, and girls. The 60s, I think, for me, our history in the 60s was probably the most traumatic decade that our country has experienced in the last century.
And were you part of that? Resist, oppose, resist authority was the call of the day for young people.
Yeah, me, no, I was more interested in hot rods and surfing.
Yeah. So that kind of passed you by.
Yeah, that kind of passed us by.
Were you in ROTC as a student?
No, I was not.
So did the war in Vietnam touch your life as it started out in the 60s?
You know, not really. It was, I think in my junior, senior year, it was just really kind of like an extra subject for history lessons, history courses. And it wasn't until the summer after we graduated that it kind of came home very personally, because the older brother of one of my dearest friends was one of the first casualties in Vietnam. He was killed in Cu Chi. And then I also had, later on that year, I had a cousin who was killed in Vietnam as well. And then it's like, wow, this is for real, what's happening here?
What happened next?
And then I was still pretty much living life like a
Hot
local
rods,
boy,
girls and surfing.
Yeah, surfing. And then I got a special call. I love to tell this story because the young soldiers today, I said, you know what? We are so proud of the decisions you made to serve your country. But you know, my legacy is a little bit different. I was very special. Uncle Sam came looking for me. He said, Mr. O, we need you. And
had you been dreading a draft call?
No. You know, in my generation, that was part of growing up. At some point, you know, you would either volunteer to become part of the then what was very fascinating All Hawaii Company, which on 4th of July every year, you know, 100 or so young high school grads would become part of the All Hawaii Company. So for me, you know, service was just going to be part of my growing up.
So that service didn't, in your mind, include combat?
No, but it included, you know, doing some time in the military.
Right. And so even when you got that call, you didn't say, oh my God, I could get sent to Vietnam. I could get put in really difficult circumstances.
Yeah, reality, I was 19. And that was not, I think, part of my reality. You know, I was young, still making perhaps unwise decisions regarding activities in life, etc. So for me, it was, I didn't feel threatened by it. Neither did I feel any kind of overwhelming sense of obligation other than to serve your country.
I understand you, after being drafted, and you could have stayed here, I think, but you volunteered to go to Vietnam?
Yes. Having grown up and hearing the stories from my aunts and uncles and cousins regarding our, quote, warrior culture, after training to become a combat medic.
Why did you train to be a combat medic?
Well, Uncle Sam said that's...
You were designated?
Designated,
okay.
Yeah, for training. And, you know, they give you a battery of tests, et cetera, and you know, who knows, but, you know, fortunately, and I feel I was very blessed to have been selected to become a combat medic. And after I trained long and hard to do that, when we graduated, all of the new combat medic qualified soldiers would go to the bulletin board to see where their next duty station was. And the bulk of my class went straight to Vietnam. I was assigned to San Francisco. And, you know, I didn't question it. And then when I got to San Francisco, I was assigned to Travis Air Force Base. The unit I was assigned to had a lot of soldiers who had come back from Vietnam, and they maybe had 3 to 6 months left on their assignment before they got out of the Army. And stories that they shared with me in terms of what it was like presented a challenge to me. And I said, you know, given my background and my family history, I don't ever want to look back and say, I wonder how I would have done in combat. And this is...
But it was a different kind of combat. I mean, it was like no other war we've had.
Yeah, but, you know, for a 19-year-old, there's only one kind of combat.
I hear that, wasn't there some Geneva Convention ruling that it's a war crime to shoot a combat medic who's clearly identified in combat, but in Vietnam,
there were no rules.
Forget it.
Forget it, right. And life expectancies for combat medics were worse than first lieutenants.
So you wore weapons?
I carried both sidearm and a rifle, and you wore nothing that indicated that you were a medic, other than your bag was bigger than the rest.
And then you went out right after people got hurt in combat.
My mission, I was with the long range reconnaissance team, and so when someone got wounded, they were generally standing right next to you, so you knew what was going on.
So you could have been hit too?
Yeah.
Did you fire your weapon?
Yes. You know, for me, part of that experience, being 20 by the time I got there, and being young and adventurous, part of my responsibility being on that team was I had to learn all the duties, all the functions of everyone else. And as the medic, I trained the members of my team to the best of my ability in terms of, you know, first responder life-saving methods. So while with the team, not only did I fire my weapons, but, you know, I helped set ambushes. I learned how to call artillery and learn how to set demolitions and blow charges. And yeah, you got to understand, for a 20-year-old, this is like fun stuff.
You don't feel that it'll actually hurt you? Do you feel untouchable?
You feel immortal.
Immortal.
Yeah. The most foolish kinds of things that one accepts in combat is that if it happens, it happens, you know. And then for me, it was, you know, as long as I can get through 3 of these life-threatening experiences, then I'll be okay. I very clearly, distinctly remember the 3 times that I was supposed to have received something fatal and survived. And after the 3rd time, it was like, oh, big relief. I said, nothing's going to happen.
I've got a force field around me.
I've got a force field around me. And then you just kind of learn how to operate chess naturally and freely. And yeah, you were still concerned. You were still frightened on occasions, but you knew that at the end of the day, nothing's going to happen. And, you know, nothing happened.
But you can't do that by skill alone, right? It is a
luck.
matter of chance.
No. It's you know, combat. You survive combat purely on luck.
And meanwhile, you were seeing some scenes you can't unsee,
Yeah.
mutilated limbs and
Yeah.
gory stuff, very sad, just grievous injuries. How did you deal with that?
For me, it was just reactionary. I trained, everyone trained.
You compartmentalized?
Compartmentalize. When stuff happened, you just instinct kicks in. And I think one of the saving graces of our current force is that our young shooters, as I call them, the young infantry soldiers or the young combat soldiers that have to go to war for us, they are required to train 24/7, and it becomes instinctive, it becomes reactionary. So when they're on a patrol, they experience enemy action, they immediately shift into their combat mode.
Did you hear the talk that we understand was common at the time where people were saying, what are we here for? Why are we here? This war doesn't make sense.
Yeah, we would hear about that or read about that in letters or the newspapers that would occasionally come to us. But the reality is, at the end of the day, in combat, you're not thinking about fighting for your country. You're not thinking about fighting to preserve, family values or the Constitution, etc. You are simply thinking about saving the life of your buddy on your right and on your left. And the reality is, at the end of the day, if you've done your job right and everybody survives, our country will be blessed by that.
Did you get really close to the guys you served with?
Oh, to this day, 50 years ago, I met an incredible bunch of young men and probably spent 24/7 with these men, maybe not more than 4 or 5 months with them. But to this day, when I hear their voice, I immediately know who I'm talking to. It's that special bond that even surpasses a familial bond. I have a relationship and memories of guys that I served with, perhaps that run deeper than with my own 2 siblings.
Wow. And when you're with somebody who's terribly hurt and possibly or inevitably dying, it's a really intimate time you share. How is that?
Yeah, for me and the guys the closest to me, if one of our buddies was hit, this is fascinating. We were doing our best to stabilize his condition, but it becomes not quiet and soft, but it becomes a loud, raucous kind of conversation to get their attention, to get them to focus, to get them to hang on and not to give up. And, so it's yelling and screaming. This is like, I remember the first time that happened, my platoon sergeant, who obviously had been there longer than me, as I was treating one of my wounded buddies, he was shaking him to get him to respond, to wake up and to fight on before we put him on the helicopter. And then I learned something that day in terms of, first, you're gonna do your job to stop the bleeding, prevent the shock, but at the end of the day, you've got to get that young soldier's attention to get him to focus on things he needs to do.
Because that helps him
yeah.
help himself.
Help himself.
You have seen some things that most people never see, never have to know what it's like.
Yeah.
How has that affected you?
At times, it causes me to kind of go into a slump, but I've always been able to deal with that in terms of that's war. And I kind of kick into this mode where a long time ago I read this passage where, in war there's only 2 rules. The first rule is that people die. And then the second rule is that you cannot change rule 1. So, we're at war, people are going to die, and thank God if you survive, that you survive.
That 1968, when you were there, that was a particularly fatal, grisly year. Lots of fatalities.
Yeah. I guess the high water mark was 1968 and May 1968. And May 1968 was a particularly bad month for me.
What happened?
I lost 18 of my guys. But for the grace of God, I would not be here because 10 of them are still missing in action. The grace of God was that my unit was transitioning from point A to point B, and I was not with them that day. I was back in the rear, getting ready to rejoin them. Before I could rejoin them at the new location, they were overrun.
And some of them were never found, but were you treating your own men in the field?
Yeah.
Was that Mother's Day?
Mother's Day.
Mother's
Day, 1968. I mean, if you can imagine, I mean, you're a mother. You know how important Mother's Day is. That day by itself, you know, to get the message or the knock on your door that your son was killed on Mother's Day. I mean.
And so now, when Mother's Day comes around at your home, you think of another meaning for it.
Yeah, I am reflective on the mothers of my men who didn't make it. And, you know, over the past 50 years, that bond I had with their sons, I've developed with them. So for me, it's very special. It is for me, it's always been an obligation to assure their mothers whose sons never came home that their sons were superb young men.
You made an effort to go do that?
Absolutely. The majority of the men who I lost on Mother's Day in 1968, their mothers and their fathers had absolutely no clue what happened to them. And to live without any knowledge of what happened, I could not understand. That's even worse, you know, to have your son taken from you in combat, and that's all you know. He's not here. Why? We can't share that with you. We can't tell you the circumstances or what happened on that day.
Do you think you had PTSD after the war?
I had issues. I don't necessarily think it is or was PTSD. Everybody who experiences combat has issues. I remember when I first came back from Vietnam, the first month I was home, it was just party time, right? And, you know, I was riding motorcycles back then, and every night we'd go out and enjoy life. You tip a few primos. And I remember, like, after a month, one day my dad came home we were passing, I think, in the driveway. I was getting ready to go out, and he was coming home from work, and he said, "Al," he said, "you have a moment?" I go, "Yeah, absolutely." He told me, he said, "You know what, son, I won't even begin to understand what you experienced in Vietnam and what you're doing now. You know, I'm not supportive of what your behavior and what your conduct is now. So, you know, how much longer are you going to do this? Because don't you think you need to start thinking about your future? I hope you're not planning to do this the rest of your life." And I said, "No, Dad, I'm just having fun." But you know, that kind of came home to roost really strong for me. My father saying, "Okay, all right, it's time to kind of like get on with your life." And you know, I did. Because he did it in such a nice way, too.
He
was just an incredible guy.
Allen Hoe's parents had always insisted he would attend college, so when he returned home, he took advantage of 2 new state institutions for learning. He enrolled in the new Leeward Community College, later graduating from UH Manoa, and he was among the first class of law students admitted to the William S. Richardson School of Law.
Okay, the style of the day was long hair.
Yeah.
So did you go back from the war with your short haircut to
long hair?
Yeah. And did you see anti-war protests?
Yeah. You know,
how did you feel about them?
You know, this may sound strange, but to me that was just part of our great democracy. You know, I tell people, I have no problems with the protests, the marchers, and the anti-war people. Even when I was in Vietnam, I said, "Hey, that's what we're here for, to give them the right to exercise, you know, their freedom." And it truly did not bother me. One of the things though that did bother me was a couple of the young Leeward students were egged on by this group to pull down the American flag, and 4 of us, Vietnam veterans, stood him off and said, "You touch that flag and you're going to go down." And they left the flag alone. I said, "You can protest the war all you want, but you're not going to come and touch this flag."
And that was a spontaneous act by the four of you.
Yeah.
Did you ever get pegged the wrong way when you walked around campus with the long hair? I mean, did people assume anything about you that wasn't true?
The wife of a soldier who was in one of my classes, and now her husband was a career soldier, had not been in combat, and she made this kind of strange comment to me. She said, "Why are you so angry?" And I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "There's just hate that comes from your eyes." And I said, "Your husband's a soldier. Has he been in combat?" "No." I said, "Well, you sent him to combat, and this is the look that he will come home with." And she just couldn't understand that. And
But it's not anger.
It's not anger. It's just, people these days, or even for many years, they call it the 1,000-yard stare.
Allen Hoe's adjustment to civilian life was bolstered when he met his future wife, Adele.
We met actually, I think maybe the second month after I got out of the Army. And, when I first saw her, I said, "Oh my God, that is the girl of my dreams."
At first look?
That first day we spent together, she was actually a co-worker of the sister of one of my dear friends. So we just kind of like wound up on a not a blind date, but on time together. And she was or is just a special person. Yeah. Swept me off my feet, so to speak.
Adele and Allen Hoe married and shared in the joy of raising two sons, Nainoa and Nakoa. Both young men chose to be warriors and serve their country. The elder son, Army First Lieutenant Nainoa Hoe, was killed by a sniper's bullet while he led a foot patrol in northern Iraq in 2005. He was just 27 years old and had been married for less than a year.
My wife and I, Adele, we still hear from the soldiers who served with the Nainoa. And that is very comforting to us. He absolutely loved being a soldier. And the fortunate part, if there is anything fortunate about that horrible tragedy, was that his last day on this earth was documented by a writer who wrote an incredible story of how my son spent his last day with his men in combat. Now for me, as a father who had experienced combat, that was just an absolutely incredible story. For me, it was very gratifying to hear how he performed in combat and how his men just dearly loved him.
I was so impressed by your son Nakoa, seeing him at an event where Nainoa was being spoken of and honored, and all the attention was on the fallen son. And Nakoa is a very, very honorable and brave and an Army leader in his own right?
Correct.
So, but it was not about him. He was just all happy to see Nainoa being celebrated. He was happy to hear the I thought he's grown up in that shadow of his big brother being venerated as a hero, and not feeling like, what about me?
Yeah, he, in retrospect, my Hawaiian culture, that's what led me to name him Nakoa. Brave, courageous, strong Army, a soldier.
It does take courage to
stand in the shadow.
To stand in the shadow, right.
And he has become just an incredible young man.
So much grace.
So much grace.
Did you teach him that grace?
His mother taught him that grace. How our family and how this community responded when our son was killed, it was, for me, it was very eye-opening. Having survived combat, having witnessed death was totally different when that knock came on our door.
2005.
2005. And then it's like our whole world just came screeching to a halt. And then, over the years, I've become very close to the Vietnam veterans efforts, the memorials, etc. Jan Scruggs is a very dear friend. And, Memorial Day 2005, I was invited to come and be a speaker at the Memorial Day ceremony at the wall. It was not the first time I had been there, but that was my first experience when I got there. And I looked at the 58,000 plus names on the wall, including like a whole panel of my guys. And I just kind of like stopped, caught my breath, and I said, oh my God. You're looking at all these names, you would think that the world would have come to a complete stop. Because I know my family.
For some it did.
Yeah,
Many.
For some it did. And for my experience and my family's experience, the world did come to a stop. But there is, it's just 58,000 plus names, and we're still at war.
Shortly before our conversation with Allen Hoe in the summer of 2018, he and 9 other local Vietnam veterans were honored at what the Army referred to as a long overdue ceremony. While only 10 veterans were selected, the Pentagon report said they represented a large number of soldiers who served in the Southeast Asia conflict but were never given a proper military ceremony to present awards and medals. Allen Hoe received a Bronze Star and Purple Heart at the ceremony and told news reporters it was well worth the wait to have the brigade you went to war with recognized years and years after that war was over. We thank Vietnam combat medic Allen Hoe for his time with us and the work he continues doing in the civilian and military communities. And we thank you for joining us. For more of Allen Hoe's conversation, including how a flag originally purchased as a souvenir in Vietnam has earned a military record of its own, and why it's in Hoe's DNA to be passionate about horses and the sport of polo, please go to pbshawaii.org and our Long Story Short archives. I'm Leslie Wilcox for Long Story Short and PBS Hawaii. Aloha nui.
For audio and written transcripts of all episodes of Long Story Short with Leslie Wilcox, visit pbshawaii.org. To download free podcasts of Long Story Short with Leslie Wilcox, go to the Apple iTunes Store or visit pbshawaii.org.
People say you do so much for the Army. And I said, you know what, when I have a quiet moment sitting in my backyard at Manuili looking up at Mount Olomana, which was one of Nainoa's favorite places, I just kind of look up there and I said, all right, son, you didn't think Dad had enough to do? So my mission has been to try and make the lives and the comfort and the memory of soldiers who put on the uniform every day for us a little bit better.